where your troubles melt like lemon drops. And Dorothy thought perhaps she was in this new country. In fact, as she was wandering around, the tune of Somewhere Over the Rainbow was playing in the background. But that question, are you a good witch or a bad witch, says, no, life isn't perfect here. There are still bad things around. You've got to work out what your choices are and how you deal with them. And Dorothy is quite nonplussed, and she spends much of the rest of the film working out what the right choices are at different points. And the way that we see her choices is mainly in her relationships. And she goes and she meets a Tin Woodman and a Cowardly Lion and a Scarecrow and a number of other people, and we see how her understanding and her choices develop as she goes around with them. Well, I don't expect you to meet those people, but Paul does give us an example of how our relationships should work in this new kingdom. And he starts with wives. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. Well, that sounds expected, pretty conventional. In 21st century Britain, perhaps we don't think it's a particularly good idea. But Paul says that that's what they should do. But he does say, as is fitting in the Lord. Then he says, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Well, that's pretty so-so as advice goes. But if we turn to Ephesians and see the advice that he gave in a similar chapter, he went into more detail. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. Well, pretty much the same. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy. So my job as a husband is to build up my wife, to support her, to give her the resources she needs. It's not to lord it over her so that she's cowering down in front of me, but to make sure that she's the best person she can possibly be, to help Jesus in his job of building her up. So I'm not a Roman husband. The Roman husbands had absolute power over their families, to the extent that if they thought they had too many children, they could just leave one out. They had an extra baby, we don't want an extra baby, expose them, leave them out, leave them to die. If somebody picked them up, well, that's their affair. It was nothing to do with me. That's the sort of authority that a Roman parent might have. But that's not the sort of authority that Paul is talking about. He's talking about a husband who is there for the benefit of his wife. And that's a husband a wife could submit to. Of course, it's not 100% easy if both husband and wife are not living in the same kingdom. If one of them's in the kingdom of Jesus and one of them is still in the kingdom of Rome, then it's difficult. Paul doesn't give completely detailed advice, but that's how he wants to change things. He doesn't want to wreck things all at once. He wants to change them from inside. So keep the relationship and change it through the love of God. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything. Well, that's practically the definition of a slave, isn't it? But do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favour, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. In the same way, you work within the relationship. You might have expected Paul to say, right, we're going to start the campaign immediately to abolish slavery. But Paul didn't do that. He said, no, I'm going to change slavery from inside, not from outside. Likewise, the masters have to provide their slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. The masters are responsible to God, just as the slaves are responsible to God for their conduct. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. I don't know, my children aren't here. I feel it's unfair to preach to other people's children if I can't preach to my children. But this is Mothering Sunday, and mothers aren't directly mentioned, other than obey your parents. And perhaps they're taken for granted. And that's very unfair, because motherhood is almost more fundamental to Christian relationships than fatherhood. We tend to think of God as father, but God is mother. God gives life to us. God gives birth to us. God nurtures us and brings us up. God holds us and catches us when we fall. All things that are associated with mothers and mothering. Mothers too must shape themselves to be like Christ. Like Jesus, who said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I've wanted to gather you in my arms like a mother hen gathering her chicks under her wings, but you wouldn't let me." The disappointment of not being able to mother his people properly comes out in that speech. So we are to take family relationships, the family relationships we grew up in, the ones around us, the employer-employee relationship, one that I'm in, that's similar to the master-slave relationship, but fortunately things have changed these days. And we are to change those relationships from inside. We don't wreck the system, we rebuild the system a brick at a time while we're living within it. I remember when I was 12, my mother died. A very traumatic time, very disappointing time for a 12-year-old boy. And I got mothered by so many people. I got mothered by the church. The church has a wonderful ministry of mothering, and the church back then mothered me. It didn't know how to, in many ways. What do you say to a 12-year-old boy and his 10-year-old sister who've just lost their mother, to their father who's just lost his wife? What can you can't make it up to them. And people didn't know what to say, but they said something anyway. They hugged us, they supported us, they gave us practical support, they gave us prayer support, and the church was a wonderful mother to us at times. And it still does it to this day. I've lost 2 close relatives in the last year. And the church is involved both here and the church down in Easingwold, where my mother-in-law worshipped, and the church over in Chester, where my sister worshipped, have been fantastic in mothering and supporting my family, me, and those friends of my sister and my mother-in-law who were hurt by their deaths. So the church has a ministry of mothering. Individuals have a ministry of mothering. Since my mother died, I haven't been without a mother. Many people have mothered me. Not just women. Men can do mothering as well. I remember when I was a bachelor working down in London, and I was depressed. I had depression for a period, and it was getting on top, and I went round to my home group leader, who was a Scottish fireman called Ken. Lovely guy, very supportive. And he talked to me, and he found out that I hadn't had a proper meal for 2 days. I went off to the kitchen, and he came